This is the first of a series of podcasts on the subject of punctuation. They go along with the Journalism 181 Punctuation Cheat Sheet. This is part 1, the introduction, why you need to know about punctuation. Before we get started thinking about actual punctuation marks, it's important to consider why we need to know about punctuation at all. Why is it important to know the rules and how to apply them properly? Well, for one thing, punctuation is the way you guide your readers through your sentence. Punctuation that is ambiguous or inaccurate can leave your readers with the wrong information. It may confuse them. If nothing else, it may distract them. And that's not a good thing. There are several well-known examples that illustrate the importance of punctuation to understanding a sentence. One famous one is, Charles I walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off. Okay, spooky and very unlikely. Punctuate that sentence correctly, however, and the meaning changes entirely. Charles I walked and talked, period. Half an hour after, comma, his head was cut off. Now, granted, this sentence is a little bit unlikely. Not too many people would fail to put some kind of period or sentence terminal punctuation after the word talked in that first example. But let's take a look at another example, one that actually reflects a fairly common kind of error. State university students who riot after football games are often drunk. State university students, comma, who riot after football games, comma, are often drunk. The first sentence predicates frequent drunkenness of exactly that set of state university students who riot after football games. There may be many of them, there may be just two. It doesn't say anything about the ones who don't. The second sentence, however, with the commas around the clause, who riot after football games, predicates a generalization of state university students overall, that they are often drunk, and adds, as a kind of an extra point, by the way, they riot after football games too. The commas around that clause, who riot after football games, make it a non-essential or non-restrictive, depending on your terminology, relative clause. That means it isn't essential to figuring out which state university students we're talking about. It's just a bit of extra, perhaps interesting information. We could leave it out of the sentence and the main point would still be there. So if we leave out that non-restrictive or non-essential relative clause, we find that our two sentences say very, very different things. And that is one important reason for paying attention to punctuation. It can completely change the meaning of a sentence. A second important reason for paying attention to punctuation is that punctuation, especially nowadays, is conventional rather than intuitive. That is, it doesn't necessarily occur where you might naturally pause while speaking. You can't go with your gut on punctuation. It is very easy to get it wrong. Take a look at this sentence, which comes from Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, published in 1729. And I should mention, in case you're not familiar with it, that the Modest Proposal is a satirical work. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food. Now, Swift was writing at a time when punctuation was often rhetorical rather than grammatically determined. So he could put the comma where he might naturally pause in the sentence, after the word London. Punctuation nowadays is determined by grammatical or syntactic structure. So we would not put a comma after London. We would, however, put commas around well nursed because it's an adjective phrase following the noun, child, that it modifies. And we would put a comma after delicious in that same line, line 3, because it's the first in a series of adjectives, and the following adjective isn't preceded by a conjunction. Now, those are grammatically and conventionally determined commas. So we have to pay attention to punctuation because it's governed by convention rather than intuition. And it's important to know what those conventions are. The third reason to pay close attention to punctuation is that the correct use of punctuation is an important part of your ethos, your self-presentation as a writer. If you're sloppy about punctuation, people will take what you say a lot less seriously because it looks like you didn't put the minimum effort into your writing. This is particularly important because most of us are familiar with different genres of writing in which punctuation is really far less important. Think, for example, of tweeting or texting. In texting, in particular, we're usually writing to people who know us pretty well, and they can interpret what we write. We're writing about a limited set of topics, and usually what we're writing is pretty simple and straightforward. As a result, if we do a lot of texting, we get used to doing without punctuation. So it takes a little extra effort to pay more attention to punctuation when we shift to more formal, or even just slightly less informal, genres of writing. So there are three very good reasons to pay attention to punctuation. First off, practicality. You want your readers to understand you. You use punctuation to guide them through your sentence. Second, accuracy. The rules of punctuation are conventional, not intuitive. You have to work at getting them right. They don't come automatically. And third, as a matter of self-presentation, you want to show that you take your writing, and therefore yourself, seriously. And that's the end of part 1.